This is part 2 of what I discussed last week. I still had this story of Ezra and Nehemiah on my mind, and I mainly spoke from the book of Nehemiah and how God worked on the behalf of God's people through Nehemiah as he administrated the process of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. But as I did some more study in the book of Ezra, I went over there and read through the book. And I also studied some resources and did some research. And it was interesting to see the patterns that developed through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible are one book. And up until we canonized the Bible, they were considered one book. We broke them apart, made them two separate books, but you can see the correlation where they both are in line with each other, and they really are one book with the same writing patterns and writing styles. And as I studied these, I noticed the same patterns in Ezra as there were in Nehemiah. That Israel saw the prophecies of God fulfilled for them, that Jeremiah declared that after a time that God would give them a jubilee and they would begin to return to Jerusalem after the judgment of God came upon them. And at this time in Ezra, this prophecy began to be fulfilled. And from Ezra to Nehemiah, there was about 90 to 100 years of this prophecy being fulfilled that God had promised through the prophet Jeremiah, that they returned to the homeland and worship was restored in Israel. But as I seen this and I noticed some things, there's some principles that I drew out from the book, and I noticed some keys that we, the church, can learn from what happened to them and what God did for them. The first thing I saw is that God, when he fulfills his promises, he brings about the resources his people need to see these promises fulfilled. In Ezra chapter 1, when King Cyrus made a decree for them to start rebuilding the temple, he also provided ample resources for the children of Israel for this to be done. He also made a way for all the temple gold, silver, things that went in the temple that were made of gold and silver and precious stones. He made a way for all that to be returned back to Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar took all of that when they ransacked Israel and they took over Israel. He took all that and put it in the house of his gods. This decree made it possible for all this to be returned to Israel. All of it. The resources returned. And he also took some of his own resources through taxation and made it possible for Israel to use this to rebuild the temple as well. God not only fulfilled his promise and said, okay, you can go back to Israel now. God provided the resources for them to rebuild what was broken down. When God has a plan for a church, when God has a plan for a people, he will provide what the people need to accomplish what God has put them there to accomplish. His resources are unlimited. Many times the reason we see limited resources is because we limit God in our faith. Trust him that if he said something, if he promised something, and we are patient enough to let him see it through, he will provide what we need. The other thing I noticed in the book of Ezra as I read this, and it's very significant, not only for the book of Ezra, but as you go into the book of Nehemiah and you read it, is that they restored worship and prayer before they actually started rebuilding the temple. In Ezra chapter 3, they built the altar of God first and made sacrifices unto him. They rebuilt it, they finished it, and they made sacrifices as one people unto God, seeking his face. That was the priority to them, because they knew they would face opposition, and they knew they would face adversity, and they wanted to make sure they got themselves in line with God's plan and God's purposes according to the law that he had written down for them. And this is something else we need to remember. That even if God is the one that provides the resource, and even if God is the God that fulfills his word to his people, it is still the responsibility of his people to rebuild and restore the altar of prayer before we build anything else, before we make any other plans. We must restore a prayerful heart to God. Because if we are not staying connected to God, then we will make mistakes and we will miss God in our part of him fulfilling his plan. God's going to fulfill his plan, but we will not see God's mind. We will not have God's mind in the process of him using us to make it happen. Prayer is vital to going forward and following God's will and God's plan for us as his people. And as we do this, we will see it through. I see names of 4 kings in these 2 books of the Bible. You see King Cyrus, you see King Artaxerxes, you see King Darius, and you see King Nebuchadnezzar's name mentioned just one time. He was conquered before these books were really written. So there's 4 kings, the one that took over Israel and kept it from worship at all. And then God restoring Israel through the first King Cyrus, and then through Artaxerxes, he helps them move back to Israel, sends them the prophet Ezra, and then King Darius giving the decree for them to finish the temple. But with all of these kings, he opened up their hearts. He spoke to them. Even though they were secular people that worshiped other gods, he softened their hearts to bring about the resources to God's people for the will of God to be fulfilled. God will use anyone and anything to make sure that his people are taken care of. If we will believe and trust God, and we will be humble before all of humanity, and not be afraid to ask, and not be afraid to request that God's will be done, and that things be accomplished, because we know we have a purpose on this earth. We have a purpose in our city. We have a purpose in our county. We have a purpose in the North Strand. If we can see this, God can manifest some things to us that the rest of the world are like, this doesn't even make sense. It can be done because we trust that what God prophesied long ago will come to pass. Now, we got to be patient with God, and sometimes things don't always work out exactly the way we think, as I said last week. So we must always be open to how God makes it happen. There were some questions left at the end of the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. It kind of had a weird ending to both books because the people missed one aspect. And they didn't understand that God was fulfilling this, bringing them back, but there was one missing component, and that was the Messiah had not come yet. And so there was always going to be that missing component. They needed to understand that Jesus was the Messiah. And the people of Israel, by the time Jesus came, hundreds of years after this story, they never saw it completely fulfilled because they rejected him. See, Jesus always must be at the center of everything. Israel missed this part, and they missed the completion of this in their time. Now that time will come again when they look upon him who they pierced, and they will receive him. Israel will get all of it back, but now they will welcome us, Gentiles who have believed in the Messiah, and we will be one, worshiping Christ forever and ever. This prophecy will be finalized in all who believe in Jesus. So we must not leave him out of the processes, and he will not be left out of the process if we want to see God's plan fulfilled in us. Remember this today, that God will see it through for us if we make Jesus at the center, we make prayer the priority, and the building of the church follows suit after the prayer. Y'all have a good day today. I hope you have a good Sunday. Just keep believing. Our construction is almost, our cleanup is almost finished. It should be finished soon. And then we are going to start having worship in the fellowship hall as we begin to work on restoring the sanctuary and getting it back into worship order. So just be in prayer with us about that. But let's stay together as a church, as many as can. We're going to try to meet somewhere every Sunday with all of our abilities. We're going to try to make that happen. This morning, we are going to meet at the church together in one accord, seeking God's face together, and we're going to do it underneath the overhang. We can fit about 60 people underneath that overhang and actually have a decent service like we did last week. So come out, expect God to do some great things this morning. Y'all have a blessed day.